floor is yours.
Thank you. So welcome everyone to the opening of the 2015-2016, can I just move this? Geary Seminar Series. Today I'm going to be presenting some work that Orla, Richard Tremblay, and myself are currently working on using a subsample of the participants that were enrolled in the Preparing for Life program. So in this study we're examining the associations between social competence and communication ability, and also the possible mediating role of parental behavior or specific parental behavior, so we're looking at parental warmth. This is a working paper, so any feedback is more than welcome. So I'm sure you've all heard the claim, well, especially if you're psychologists, that the first 5 years are the most important in terms of development of the child. And despite recent advances in the field of neuroscience, for example, that do reveal neuroplasticity well into the adolescent years and adulthood, research does continue to show how important the early years are towards brain development for multiple domains, so the child's cognitive development, but also their social development. And this has been further supported by the high amount of studies, cross-disciplinary work specifically, that show that intervention and remediation in the earliest years has the greatest long-term impacts and benefits towards development well into adolescence and then once again in adulthood. So before I jump into the current study and the surrounding theory, we're just going to take a minute briefly to define the constructs. So what do I mean when I talk about social competence? And more importantly, what is social competence in a toddler or in a 2-year-old? Well, broadly speaking, and at the most basic of levels, social competence relates to one's social relationship. So it's the ability to get along well with others. In infancy, the most frequent types of social relationships that the infant will be exposed to are familial relationships. So example, the parent-infant, grandparent-infant, even sibling-infant. And these interactions are important for development, for the infant's social development and their competence. However, there's a different dynamic in a family relationship as compared to other types of social relationships that the infant will start to become exposed to in the toddler years when, for example, they become enrolled in daycare programs. So this is when they're going to start having exposure to peer relationships, for example. And peer relationships differ from family relationships in that peer relationships are freely chosen, whereas a parent-child relationship is not freely chosen. So if the child displays behaviors that aren't socially competent during interactions, the parent just can't just say, well, I don't like you, so go away now. Whereas a peer can say this. So the social competence is really important in terms of a child's peer relationships, in that it's going to affect the quality, the stability, and the durability of these types of interactions. So peers are less forgiving as compared to family members if the social interactions are of poor quality, for example. So these early years are very important and necessary in developing social competence before the child enters into formal schooling, when the majority of their day is going to be social interactions with their peers and also with their teachers, for example. So what skills are necessary in terms of social competence? Well, there are many skills that encompass social competence, and some examples would include the child's ability to self-regulate during social situations, the child's ability to take the perspective of others, not just their own perspective, which ties into theory of mind. There's also information processing of social cues, for example, during interactions with others. There's the child's moral development, so their sense of right and wrong. There's also the child's engagement in prosocial and positive behaviors. And finally, communication skills. So this brings us to our second construct of interest, which is communication ability. And now I'm going to pose the question, when does communication start? Well, it actually starts in the first few weeks or months after the child's born, where we see that communicative intent starts to become apparent. So the infant will start to communicate through paralinguistic communication, such as cooing, babbling, vocalizations, gestures. And between 12 and 36 months, we see the largest milestones in terms of the child's communication development. So for example, the infant or toddler is going to start displaying joint attention skills, and this usually happens between 10 and 15 months, It is also during this time that they're going to start to retain meaning in language, so simple commands, and also produce their first words. Then it is usually between 15 and 18 months where the child is going to reach the milestone of a 50-word vocabulary. And then toddlers subsequently will undergo large vocabulary spurts up until about 36 months, where they should be able to produce a range of sentence types, including the ability to pose questions. So based on these definitions of both constructs, we can see that the 12 to 36 month period is highly important to both the emergence and development of communication skills and social competence. Okay, so how are social competence and communication ability associated? Well, there are three possible paths of direction. So the first would be social competence to better communication ability. And theoretically, toddlers who are socially competent are going to have more opportunities for social interaction, consequently increasing their communicative exchange with others, as social competence increases the likelihood that any social relationships that are being formed are going to also be maintained. So peers are probably going to be more motivated to continue to have repeat interactions with a child who is considerate, who is able to understand their perspectives and the perspectives of others, and who is positive and engages in prosocial behaviors, and who is generally competent. So because the social environment supports the child's communication development, these increased opportunities and these increased interactions can impact positively on the child's communication ability. Now, alternatively, we have seen associations in the other direction from good communication abilities to increased social competence. And this is because communication skills form the basis of how children facilitate and engage in interactions with others. So communication ability allows the toddler to better understand the perspectives of others, to create meaningful exchanges with others, and then to express their self in a socially appropriate manner. And all of these skills are necessary to build social competence. So finally, it's also possible that there's a bidirectional association between communication ability and social competence, as both constructs are dependent on and supported by the social environment and interaction with others. So in terms of the literature, there are typically more studies in the direction of communication to increase social competence. So for example, in a recent study conducted by Rhea and her colleagues in 2013, they found that children who had better language skills at 14 months, so both expressive and receptive, had higher concern for others and lower disregard for others, which are both markers of social competence by 36 months. Additionally, Orla, Richard, and myself, along with two other colleagues, have just submitted a study using the Millennium cohort data, which looked at prosocial behaviors specifically, which is a marker of social competence and expressive language. And we examined the cross-legged associations between prosocial behavior and expressive language from 36 to 60 months. And in the univariate model, we found support for a bidirectional association, so concurrent paths, a double flush from prosocial and expressive language at 36 months, and then at 60 months as well. We also found a cross-legged association, so children who had better expressive language at 36 months engaged in higher prosocial behaviors at 60 months. Now, what's interesting about that particular study is that when we reran the model using a multivariate approach, so introducing the control variables, of which were parenting behaviors, we lost the concurrent path between prosocial behaviors and expressive language at 36 months. So that kind of indicated that the inclusion of controls maybe possibly mediated that initial relationship that we were seeing at 36 months. Another recent study examining the associations between language and prosocial behavior was conducted by Barnett and colleagues in 2012. And in this study, they found no direct associations between children's language and their prosocial behaviors. However, what they did find was a transactional model of language and prosocial behaviors that was mediated through the parental behavior and the parent-child relationship. So they looked at parental sensitivity specifically, and they found that parental sensitivity predicted increases in the child's language ability and also their prosocial engagement, but also that children who had better language abilities and who were more prosocial were found to have parents who were more sensitive to their needs over time. So the culmination of these latter two studies is actually what led to the motivation of the current study, to look at not only the directional nature of associations between communication and social competence in the first 2 years of life, but also to examine the possible mediating role of parenting and more specifically parental warmth. Okay, so parental warmth is defined as an expressed interest and involvement in the toddler. So an interest in the toddler's activities, in the toddler's friends, in the toddler's development overall. It is also a responsiveness to the toddler's needs. It is an enthusiasm and praise of the toddler's accomplishments, so developmental milestones that they might reach. In general, it is parenting that is supportive and sensitive to the toddler's growth. So parental warmth towards the toddler can positively impact on their social development by modeling patterns of emotions and behaviors that are socially appropriate or adaptive to the social situation, and that facilitate toddlers' own emotional understanding in social situations. Okay, so where are the gaps, or what still needs to be addressed? Well, to start, there are a lack of studies that examine the associations that start in the first year, so in the first 12 months. Second, there are transactional models and studies that do look at this, but it's not as large a focus as it should be, because, for example, no doubt that parents' behavior is going to influence on the toddler's development, but in turn, a toddler's development is also going to impact upon the parent's behavior, and we don't see as many studies looking at this direction of association. And so we need a more clear picture in terms of that. And then finally, more work is needed, and this also relates to the second point, which are numbered wrong, sorry. Finally, we need more I completely lost my train of thought with this numbering thing. Anyways, okay, so, there's a lack of clarity surrounding the directional association, so we need more work that looks at all possible directional paths, so not just univariate paths. So typically the choice of statistical technique that has been employed in this type of research allows for a unidirectional test of association. So a regression analysis is commonly used where we set the hypothesis a priori and we say that this is going to impact on this, but we're not looking at a model where we can say, well, X might impact on Y, but does Y impact on X at the same time? So that's needed. And this brings us to the objectives of the current study, which were the following. So first and foremost, we wanted to examine the associational path between toddlers' communication ability and their social competence across a 2-year period, so from 12 to 36 months. And second, we wanted to examine the possible mediating and transactional role of parental warmth in terms of the association between social competence and communication ability. Okay, so in terms of the methodological approach, so I'll just briefly talk about the larger overall study for a minute to give those of you some context who aren't necessarily familiar with the Preparing for Life program. So to start, the Preparing for Life program, which I'll now refer to as PFL because it's easier, is an early intervention program that's focused or concentrated in disadvantaged communities, which was designed to increase children's school readiness across 5 different domains of development. So these domains included the child's cognitive development, their physical health and motor skills, their social, emotional, and behavioral development, their approaches to learning, and then language and literacy development. In terms of eligibility criteria for inclusion in the PFL program, it was that the mother be living in the catchment area and that she was pregnant between January of 2008 to August of 2010. Additionally, a comparison group was recruited from another community with similar demographics, and the sample-based recruitment for the PFL program, was 67%, whereas the match comparison was 36%. Now, participants in the PFL program were randomly assigned to one of two treatment groups, so either high or low, using a computer-based randomization procedure. So I'm not going to spend too much time going into the actual program details or the treatment details, but just so you can see, here are the results of the randomization procedure. So there was 115 mothers that were randomized to the high treatment group, 118 to the low treatment group, and then a sample comparison of 99 mothers. And a randomization, I might note, was successful and has been documented very extensively. If you'd like more information about that, you can always speak to Orla. Okay. So in terms of the current sample, we included only mothers that were randomized to either the high or the low treatment group. So as mentioned, the randomization had worked well, and there were no significant differences on the majority of measures collected at baseline between the two treatment groups. However, the matched comparison group was statistically significant. There was they were different. Okay, good. So they were different on many variables. So we decided to exclude them from the model and just focus on these two groups of mothers. And we pooled the two groups because we needed a large enough sample size to be able to run the cross-legged models. So this led to a possible inclusion of 233 mothers. However, as is typical in longitudinal designs, there was attrition. So from the original randomization, where there was 233 possible families, to baseline, that went down to a possible selection of 205. And then at 6 months, again, it dropped down to 174 mothers and their infants and families. So that formed the basis of the current study. Okay, so here are some demographics of the sample. And we can see here that about 2/3 of the mothers are not actually employed at baseline. So that's reversed. 1/3 is employed. Just over half are single. Now, it's important to note, in terms of, we collapse these categories just for visual ease, but so single includes, the mother could have reported that she has a partner, but the partner isn't living in the home, so we consider that as single. Then approximately half of the sample is living in social housing. For just under half of the sample, this is their first time being a mother. And we can see that the mean maternal age is around 25 years. In terms of the measures, so we use the Ages and Stages questionnaire, which is an overall screening measure assessing children or toddlers' development for delays across 5 different domains of development, which include their communicative development. Communication was assessed at 12, 18, 24, and 36 months. An example of an item at the 12-month questionnaire would be, does your baby say one word in addition to mama, dada? An example at 36 months would be, for example, does your child make sentences that are 3 to 4 words long?
So they don't actually talk to the kids to assess their communication ability?
No, it's done through a screening measure. Like, you mean?
The interviewer?
Yes, no. It's all through parent report. In terms of social competence, the brief infant toddler social and emotional assessment, or BITSE, was used. Again, the assessments occurred at 12, 18, 24, and 36 months. And example items for the BITSE would be, does your child play well with other children? Or does your child try and help when someone is hurt? Finally, in terms of parental warmth, we assess that using the parental cognition and conduct toward the infant scale, which is also a parent report that measures parents' perceptions about their roles and their practices across 5 different domains of parenting, which included parental warmth. So the warmth scale in particular is comprised of 5 items, and an example item from this scale was, I would often play with my baby. For example, I regularly take the time to amuse him or her, to make him or her laugh when I change his or her diaper. Okay, in terms of the statistical approach, we made use of cross-legged modeling using full information maximum likelihood to deal with missing data, which has been shown to be a very unbiased method in terms of handling missing data. So we looked at 3 different paths. We looked at the autoregressive path, which, for example, would be social competence at 12 months to social competence at 18 months. We looked at the concurrent paths, so that's the bidirectional at the same time point. So that would be, for example, social competence at 12 months to communication at 12 months. And then we looked at cross-legged also, which would be, for example, communication at 12 months to social competence at 18 months. We present standardized beta in each model as a measure of effect size. Just in terms of model evaluation, to see whether or not the model is a good fit to the data, typically there are 3 different model fit indices that are reported. So the root mean square of approximation, or the Ramsey, and it's been suggested that equal to or less than 0.06, but even up to 0.08 is good to acceptable. We also present the comparative fit model because this is one of the indices that is least affected by sample size, and it has been suggested that equal to or greater than 0.095 represents a good model fit. And finally, we present the standardized root mean square residual, which has been suggested equal to or less than 0.05 as a good model fit. In terms of our hypothesis, okay, so I don't know what happened with the numbering thing, but it should be 1, 2, 3. So we first hypothesized that we would find a reciprocal effects model. So that is that we'd find positive associations, cross-legged associations in both directions. So that children who had better communication ability early on would be more prosocial later on, and vice versa, children who were more socially competent early on would have better communication later on. However, we did think that we would find stronger effects, given the current literature, in the association of early communication to later social competence. Our second hypothesis was twofold. So we expected that parental warmth would mediate the associations that we found between children's social competence and their communication ability. And additionally, we expected to find transactional association. So what I mean by that is that we expected that parental warmth would positively impact upon the development of children's communication and their social competence, but conversely, we also expected that children who had better communication abilities and who were more socially competent would have parents who later on were exhibited more parental warmth towards them. So here are some descriptive statistics of our sample. So we present the means and standard deviations for the 4 assessment periods for both communication and social competence. So the ASQ, as mentioned, is a screening tool, and there have been certain cutoff points that have been identified in the manual where if the toddler scores under, should be referred for clinical evaluation. And the criteria is set based on the means of close to 8,000 children, and if the child scores below 2 standard deviations of that cutoff score. So at 12 months, the cutoff score identified is 15.8. At 18 months, it's 23. At 24 months, it's 36.5, and then at 36 months, it's 38.7. So we can see here that for the majority of the sample, none fell under that range where they would need to be referred for additional services. Also to note here, there's not a linear progression in terms of the mean, and this is because the assessments aren't necessarily a sequential progression in terms of the skills. So they're not asking the same questions at each assessment point, and they're not necessarily building on the exact same processes. So for example, in communication, it's a very, very broad perspective. So what communication looks like at 12 months is going to be different from 18 months. So that's actually normal, and not that the sample regressed. In terms of the BITSI, the cutoff scores were set at the 15th percentile in the manual for needing referral to identify any possible deficits or delays. And at 12 months, the cutoff score was 12. At both 18 and 24 months, the cutoff score is 14. And then at 36 months, the cutoff score is 15. So once again, we see that our means don't fall below that. And overall, the sample is, there's not really any problems in terms of their social competence. So again, some more descriptive statistics, but just before I continue with the results, I want to point out that the objectives of the study were not to evaluate the treatment program. However, we did combine two different treatment programs, so high and low. So before we ran any of our statistics, what we did was we ran independent sample t-tests to ensure that there weren't in fact any group differences on communication ability, on social competence, or on parental warmth at any of the assessment points, and no statistically significant differences were found. So that's just to note. So here are the simple bivariate correlations, and we can see that social competence and communication ability are correlated at every single point in assessment, and it's in the direction that we would expect. So it's a positive association whereby children who have better communication skills are also rated as more socially competent. Okay, so here are the results of the bivariate model, and so to note at the bottom, here's our model fit, and it was a good model fit. Also to note, even though, as I mentioned, we ran independent sample t-tests, we still did control for a group in this model. It's not presented for visual simplicity, and also because it wasn't significant, but it was in there. Okay, so in terms of autoregressive, we find that we have significant autoregressive paths across all assessments for both of our constructs. And the associations are moderate, with the exception of this one. And this, again, probably relates to what I was talking about earlier in terms of the ASQ and the type of assessment that it is. So we're going to see change across these two different time periods because we're looking at different skills. But it's the fact that we still have a significant autoregressive path means that we're still examining or measuring the construct of communication.
Sorry, Lisa, is this a multivariate model or is this just bivariate?
No, this is just bivariate. We have the multivariate coming next.
Is this the FIML model?
Pardon?
Is this the FIML model you talked about?
Yes.
And how does that differ from just running individual regressions?
Because we're looking into the model, we're putting all of the regressions in one model. We're not looking at it separately.
But I guess, what is the difference? Like, if you just ran all these separate regressions, what is the difference in how it's modeled? Is it just that the errors are allowed to be correlated across the different regressions, or is there something else as well?
Sorry, what was the line? Is it just that?
Is it just that the error terms and the different regressions are allowed to be correlated in this model?
They're allowed to covary.
But is that the only difference? Like, how is this different from, say, seemingly unrelated regressions?
From which?
So seemingly unrelated regression, where you just stack a bunch of regressions and allow the errors to be correlated.
Well, because with that, you're not taking into, for example, here are our regressions, right? Our cross-legged. But when we do a regression, we're not taking into account the autoregressive path, which I'm going to discuss later on in terms of how we interpret the results. But for example, when we're looking at a regression, so it could just be that we're looking at a correlation between these two variables that isn't measured in this analysis. However, when we put the model together, we're taking into account the initial levels of both predictor and outcome, and so this is based solely from here to here. We're factoring out the variance of the initial skill at the preceding time.
I don't understand, but I guess it's a complicated model.
I can send you a paper on it. Basically, so
are there any exclusion restrictions in this?
Exclusion in terms of?
So to say, okay, because these are just bivariate relationships, so we can't have exclusions. Okay. So I just struggle to understand how these what do we call them, correlations, are different from what you just if you did them one by one.
Right, and it's because of the inclusion of the autoregressive paths here. So it's basically this is now based on residual variance because it's taking into account, so this association, it's taking into account this association
Okay, so they sort of take account of each other somehow.
Okay. Talked about autoregressive. Okay, so we have significant autoregressive paths. We also have significant concurrent paths, so bidirectional. So we see that communication at 12 months and social competence at 12 months are associated, and this is the strongest effect in terms of the concurrent path. We also find a concurrent path at 18 months and then 24 months, but interestingly, not at 36 months. In terms of our cross-leg path, so as hypothesized, we did find effects in both directions. So we found that better communication at 12 months led to an increase, better communication at 12 months led to an increase in social competence at 18 months, which in turn led to an increase in communication abilities at 24 months. And then children who were more socially competent at 12 months had better communication skills at 18 months. So all effect size are modest to moderate, just to note. Now, here is the multivariate model with parental warmth included. And the model fit was slightly better in terms of the Ramsey, but overall it's pretty similar. So all paths remain statistically significant with the exact same effect size, which tells us right away that parental warmth is not actually mediating this association between communication ability and social competence. However, our results do point to transactional associations, especially in terms of the social competence. So we see that at 18 months, children who are more socially competent tend to have parents who engage in more parental warmth by 24 months, and in turn, this predicts children an increase in social competence at 36 months. So what was interesting about this particular model is that we happened to find a very unexpected result in terms of here. So this is a negative association. So it's basically saying that children who have better communication skills at 18 months have parents at 24 months who display or engage in less warmth towards them. So to note, the association is very, very small by contrast to all of our other associations, and it also sat on the cusp of statistical significance. So it was significant at P049.
So this is when the kids learn to say no.
Pardon?
This is when the kids learn to say no.
Probably. Or why? Why? Okay. And so also here in terms of parental warmth at 6 months, we didn't find any significant associations, which was odd. So in terms of our results, they both support and enhance the existing literature in important ways. So our results support the research that have found positive associations between social competence and communication abilities. Our results add to the literature by using a longitudinal design rather than just cross-sectional data. Also, data was collected in infancy, and there are 4 different time points of assessment between this 2-year period, which is nice. So we do show that the associations are already present by 12 months, which means that there is a need for more studies that start in the really early years. And finally, we found support for a transactional model between parental warmth and social competence. Okay, so I'm just going to take a minute now to get into the cross-legged modeling techniques. So, of course, we're most interested in the cross-legged associations, which is the regression within the model, given the research question. We want to know what's predicting what, what's causing what. But we will never say causing, we'll say predicting. It's better. However, equally important with respect to the confidence that we can have in understanding the cross-legged associations is the autoregressive path. So the autoregressive path deals with the stability of the construct. And from a developmental perspective, this is important because we're going to expect change over time in the construct of interest. So for example, a child's communication ability is going to grow drastically from 12 to 36 months, for example. But when we're modeling the associations longitudinally, we want to ensure that there's a congruency of our measure over time. We want to be able to say that, yes, in fact, at each time point, we're measuring the same underlying construct. So the results show a sizable estimate of effect for all of our regressive paths, which say that, yes, in fact, we are measuring the same construct over time. So we are measuring the same types of communication abilities over time. Also, statistically speaking, the inclusion of the autoregressive path, as I mentioned, it controls for the previous variance of the construct being predicted. So, for example, it takes away the variance from social competence at 18 months to 12 months. Goes backwards. Sorry, 12 months to 18 months. So this leaves the cross-legged estimates to be based on residual variance and ensures more confidence in terms of the cross-legged associations as the model has taken into account that initial level of our variables. So this reduces the likelihood that the effects observed across time are merely the result of a correlated time one communication and social competence, for example. So in terms of the main research question, we found reciprocal cross-legged associations from the 12 to 24 month period. So our results show that the nature of associations work in both directions, so that toddlers with better communication ability also exhibit greater social competence, and in turn, those who are more socially competent have better communication skills over time. We also found that in addition to the longitudinal or cross-legged associations, that we find cross-sectional support, so that was the concurrent paths, at every time point except for 36 months, and that these associations present very early on in development, so they're already observable by 12 months. Now, what's really interesting about our results is that we found a slightly stronger association in the direction of social competence to better communication, whereas in the literature it's typically the inverse, so better communication to social competence. In terms of our second hypothesis, so it was twofold, and we expected to find support for both mediational model and then transactional associations. So according to Kenny, a mediation model requires that 4 conditions be satisfied. So the first is that there must be an association between the predictor and the outcome, which we did show. There must be an association between the predictor and mediator. Now, depending if you're talking about from the perspective of communication to social competence or the inverse, we have partial support. There also has to be an association between the outcome and mediator. And then finally, and most importantly, that initial association between the predictor and outcome should either be reduced for partial mediation or it should be completely wiped clean for full mediation. Our effect size remain the same and our paths remain statistically significant. So we don't have enough support to say that in this particular sample or in this model that mediation effects are occurring. However, we did find support for transactional effects. So where socially competent behaviors at 18 months increased parental engagement in high levels of parental warmth at 24 months. And this in turn increased children's or toddlers' socially competent behaviors by 36 months. Unexpectedly, we found a negative impact of better communication ability at 18 months to a reduction in parental warmth at 24 months. But as mentioned, the stat on the cusp of statistical significance, so warrants replication before we can actually say that toddlers with better communication are going to have parents who are less sensitive towards them over time. It may be, though, that for parents who are already under a certain level of stress because of social conditions of disadvantage, that a toddler who is very, very chatty may create additional stress under certain conditions, leading to a decrease in the parental warmth exhibited towards that child. But this should be cautioned against or in terms of interpretation until we replicate.
Well, presumably the other possibility is that parents are just responding to their children's needs, so that the child is already very talkative. You don't need to talk them and think to them all the time because they figured it out.
Yeah, yes, and that's a good point. But in terms of the language literature, we see that typically there is an association between children with better language ability and parents' engagement in turn taking. So in terms of verbal interaction. So we see a higher level of that to facilitate, because language is often learned, so there's the genetic, biological component, but also very dependent on the environment. So usually there is a positive association there that parents will engage more with a child who's communicating more with them.
Right, but they might engage in different ways.
Definitely.
Like you've got a kid who is very communicative, you might buy him books and let him read them himself. Well, got a child who struggles, you might read them. Or,
Right.
And each of them is an investment that you think is that to your child. It may be, I was just saying, so it may be measured in different ways with your questionnaires.
No, that's a good point. It was surprising to see a negative association with parental warmth, because we weren't measuring a construct of the parental-child engagement in terms of turn-taking and verbal exchanges, for example. So in terms of the practical implications, by 12 months we find bidirectional associations which are already present, and there's mutually influential impacts one on the other over time. Communication ability and social competence are associated with long-term success in formal schooling, both academically and socially, and so should be a high focus in the early years of development. And fostering positive growth in early development needs to be approached from a holistic perspective, given the interrelations across domains of development. So while the current study has strengths, such as being able to examine all possible directions of association simultaneously, the assessment of toddlers starting at the end of the first year, and then multiple assessments over a 2-year period, so 4 different assessments, there are certain limitations that do need to be addressed. And the first is related to the alphas of the measure, especially with the ASQ, which were on the low end of acceptable. So one of the greatest challenges in using a measure with low internal consistency is that any association found is going to be attenuated by the reduction of maximum observable correlations. So in plain English, this means that our results could in fact be underestimated. Second, related to the ASQ, the scale measures communication abilities very, very broadly and encompasses many aspects of language and understanding using only 6 items. Because communication and language is a system that's made up of many, many different skills, where deficits or strengths in one area are not necessarily going to mean deficits or strengths in another area, it may actually be more beneficial to break down communication skills and look at them separately as opposed to one overall communication ability measure. Third, despite that we did test for group differences and we controlled for group status in our models, and even though there was no statistically significant differences between the 2 groups, the study results are not generalizable to a larger public because they're using families that were part of an early intervention program. Finally, all the measures that we used were based on parent report. So parent reports have been well validated in the literature in terms of child development, especially given their intimate knowledge of their children. However, from a statistical point of view, this raises the issue of shared method variance. And this is a limitation as it can lead to both over and underestimation and consequently both type 1 and type 2 errors. So our results are very interesting, I think, in the context of the current literature, but they need to be evaluated cautiously at the moment until we replicate. And so despite the outlined limitations, our results once again point to reciprocal and transactional associations between communication, social competence, and parental warmth in the toddler years. And we see that early development is a dynamic process that's shaped by many factors, including within-child factors in the caregiving environment. And programming efforts should be tailored towards enhancing positive growth in the toddler years, and they'll more likely be effective if they target all dimensions of development holistically.